To me, he was, he was a badass.
He was very sensitive to the community.
He was absorbed by his work.
If I could use an image, it's like a
And he would,
superpower.
look at the names of his illustrators and
My
He
fault.
was Walter. And there was no doubt about it. He was Wally. No, he wasn't Walter. He was Wally.
Walter Dubois Richards, or Wally as he was known by his family and friends, was an accomplished artist and illustrator. His body of work ranges from lithographs to newspaper advertisements, lino cuts to greeting cards, watercolors to stamps. Wally is best known to us New Canaanites as the artist behind several sketches of Waveney Park, God's Acre, and other iconic town locations, many of which ended up on Christmas cards in your local drugstore or gift shop. But he was so much more. Across his over 70-year career, Walter Richards has brushed shoulders with some of America's most prestigious artists, created some of the most popular and well-designed advertisement posters of World War II, and stood on the front lines of Vietnam to provide groundbreaking depictions of the horrors of war. Today we dive into the humble beginnings of Walter Richards, from Ohio to New Canaan, with a few stops along the way.
Whatever you decide to do it well. And don't try and fake it. You've got to live with yourself, and besides, people eventually pick up on it.
Walter Richards was born on September 18th, 1907, in Penfield Township in Lorain County, Ohio, to Ralph Dubois Richards, a high school biology teacher, and Ruby Mildred Smith. As a child, he spent time in a family cottage in Put-in Bay on Lake Erie, just over 50 miles from his home in Lorain County. It was this scenic location that sparked Walter's love for water as a subject matter, one he would capture all throughout his prolific career. After graduating from Rocky River High School in 1925, and in desperate need of money for art school, Walter became a land surveyor, using his math and geometry skills to produce accurate calculations and sketches. 5 years later, Walter graduated from the Cleveland School of Art with honors, a special postgraduate scholarship, and an honorable mention for an illustration department prize. Following his graduation, Walter borrowed $300 from his father and set off for the Windy City.
Chicago is new, exciting, fun. Chicago is something you've just got to see for yourself.
Chicago was, and still is, an internationally recognized art and design hub, with one of its most popular commercial art centers being the Sundblom School of Illustration. Birthed by the artist Haddon Sundblom, best known for his depiction of Santa Claus for the Coca-Cola Company, the school gave rise to such names as Kobe Whitmore, Howard Turpning, and Gil Elvgren. It became common practice for rising commercial artists to study under Sundblom before moving to New York to begin their own careers closer to the advertising agencies and magazine publishers of the day. While an apprentice at Sundblom, Walter Richards studied alongside the likes of Harry Anderson, Arthur Surin, Jack Wittrup, and many, many more. When they weren't studying the intricacies of American advertising and illustration, Walter and company would use the cab fare intended for delivering artwork to buy lunches. Reflecting on his time at the Sundblom School, Walter said,
It was the height of the Depression, and I was lucky. especially because there were 40 or more other artists who wanted that position.
Now that we've uncorked our program, we'll have a ballad. That means a song from Ray Everly and the spotlight on our famous Reed section, Our Love Affair.
Upon returning to Ohio during the Great Depression, Walter Richards met a young artist by the name of Glenora Case. Glenora was a student at the Cleveland Institute of Art who would go on to become one of the most highly regarded miniature painters of her time, and a key member of the American Society of Miniature Painters. For now, however, she was doing 20-minute sketches at a Cleveland department store for 25 cents a piece. Later that year, Walter and Glenora were married and spent their honeymoon in pitched tents on Put-in Bay, sketching and painting.
What did she used to say? Something about a young man that was courting her. She could have married him and had a very sedate life as a musician. She could have had that life. But she liked his spirit better. She liked his get up and go. She liked his, for lack of a better term, pursuit.
I do remember my grandmother talking about Wally after he passed away, and you know, it's very clear that she loved him immensely. Like, they were, without question, soulmates, and they were married for 75 years.
Take me back to old Yazoo. Everything up here is new. I can't stand it, just must land it. Going back to old Yazoo.
Returning to Cleveland that same year, Walter Richards joined Tranquillini Inc., also referred to as Tranquillini Art Studios, a collective of advertising artists. It was here that Walter met artist and future colleague Steve Dohanos. While the two tried to create lithographs in Cleveland with Tranquillini, they had little success, and eventually moved to Eastport, Maine to study with legendary lithographer Stowe Wangenroth. Stowe was set up at a summer school run by the president of the prestigious American Watercolor Society. Lauded as the greatest black and white artist in America, Stowe showed Walter and Steve how to use litho pens, crayons, and other important tools, shaping the careers of these two young artists.
He talks about how he was with his good friend there, studying under Wengenroth, and they were doing a watercolor on a beach somewhere, and a seagull like pooped onto his painting, or it might have been his friend's painting, and he said he just joked around about turning it into a cloud, and thought that was a mistake.
Walter's first published print, The Black Mantle, was shown in May 1932 at the Cleveland Museum of Art's May Show. Little is known about this lino cut, including what the titular Black Mantle even refers to. Following his showing at the May Show, Walter worked in various mediums, most notably in watercolors such as this untitled work of a dead tree, and in lithographs, including these pieces titled Drying Racks and Rose Lawn, respectively. In 1935, Walter entered a limited editions club competition with a book he had illustrated and designed. His work became 6th in the nation and was exhibited at a Fifth Avenue gallery.
Going back to old Yazoo.
Odor condition your home with Wizard Wick Deodorizer. It keeps...
You say Tex, boom boom, the foaming cleanser, boom 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 boom, floods the dirt right.
In 1935, Walter Richards followed his friend Steve Dohanos to the Charles E. Cooper studio in New York. Created by Charles E. Cooper, a skilled artist of the day, the studio attracted, developed, and promoted countless talented artists, such as Hardy Gramatke, Kobe Whitmore, who you'll recognize from the Sunbloom School, and Alex Ross. These illustrators were household names in what was considered the golden age of illustration.
the era definitely fueled the idea that there were illustrators of that kind of caliber. Like there's a great article in a magazine called Illustration Magazine that was written by a friend of mine. He talked to some of the artists who were there, and they said to him, one artist said to him, "We're basically rock stars." You know, like that's the status that they enjoyed. They were rock stars of their day.
Leif Pang is a Canadian illustrator and creator of the Today's Inspiration blog, a collection of mid-20th century magazine artists. For the purposes of our project, he's also the resident expert on the Charles E. Cooper Studio.
It's really weird for us today, and Walter Richards would have been in the same boat if he was, associating with the circle of illustrators that we're talking about. All of those artists were paid phenomenally well, like to a level that is almost impossible for us to imagine today. Like, you think about the time period we're talking about, the 1930s, the average person working at a factory job or a desk job or whatever, they maybe were bringing home like $25 a week. These artists were making like something in the neighborhood of, let's say, like $1,000 per illustration. Something that might take them 2 or 3 days, or maybe at most a week or two to complete.
While working with the Charles E. Cooper Studio, Walter Richards had illustrated no less than 15 covers for the American Legion magazine. His first work for the Legion was a February 1949 scene of two men bowling. His August 1995 cover captures a scene of tourists on a ferry visiting the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. Notably, elements of this image can be traced back to Walter's own personal photography. Walter's final cover for the Legion was published in June 1957.
Certainly, I found in this article, in Neil's article, I found a photo of a 2-page spread from a Cooper Studio brochure showing various artists at work circa 1940s, and there is this tiny little photo of Walter Richards right there where my finger is.
When he wasn't creating magazine covers, Walter was producing illustrations for several divisions of General Motors, including Cadillac and Pontiac. Most notably, as Cadillac shifted its focus towards manufacturing precision parts for the new liquid-cooled Allison aircraft engine, Walter was tasked with creating illustrations of the new transmission. In addition to GM, Walter was commissioned by numerous large companies through the Charles E. Cooper Studio, including Univiz, Ford Motor Company, Conoco, Goodyear, and many, many more. In an interview discussing his time with the Charles E. Cooper Studio, Walter said,
"I hope I never see another wheel again." We strive hard for the best art we can do, but you're lucky if you get 60% of what you hope for. There are just so many people to please.
Still with the Cooper Studio, Walter Richards moved to New Canaan, Connecticut in 1941, where he and Glenora would remain for the rest of their lives. Walter managed a small workroom on the second story of the couple's New Canaan home, where he framed his artwork, managed his paperwork, and, of course, continued his career as an artist. Walter created lithographs of a number of familiar New Canaan scenes: Christmas caroling on God's Acre, ice skating at Mead Park, and the New Canaan train station. He used many of these prints as holiday cards to his family and friends, many of which are kept within the New Canaan Historical Society's vault. Walter was particularly fond of God's Acre and the Congregational Church of New Canaan, which were a frequent subject of his work. Upon his passing, Walter's service was held at the Congregational Church.
Visiting them, I was always awestruck by their home because it was like walking into an art museum. Every square inch of the walls were covered with their artwork, their friends' artwork, and sculpture, and just things that they had either produced or just had accumulated.
Walter would regularly give tours of New Canaan to his family and friends, consisting mostly of locations featured in his lithographs, accompanied by countless stories of his early days in the town. When he wasn't giving tours, creating or exhibiting work, or taking photos, Walter held classes at his home and mentored aspiring young artists. One such apprentice was Lurleen Napola.
I think he made me a founding member of the Rowayton Arts Society or Art Guild. I'm not sure. I think they called it a guild.
I sat down with Lurleen to discuss her time as a student and friend of Walter Richards.
So I went there and asked who would I work, how did they offer classes? Well, yeah, but they were daytime classes. I was working, I couldn't do that. But they suggested that I go see him. I think I just called him up and asked him if I could come and work. Did he have classes? Yes, he had classes. He had groups of ladies that came during the week, but I could only come on the Saturday classes when it was mostly men, so I grew up with brothers. That didn't bother me.
Walter and Glenora had seemingly found their forever home on Garish Lane in New Canaan. But it wouldn't be long before Walter would find himself on the front lines in one of the longest and bloodiest wars in U.S. history.
Hurry right away, no delay.
Ladies and gentlemen, we may be approaching a fateful hour. All night long, bulletins have been pouring in from Berlin, claiming that D-Day is here, claiming that the invasion of Western Europe has begun.
In the onset of the Second World War, the United States government saw the power, and more importantly, the necessity, of moral support from the public as a weapon against the Axis powers. Patriotic propaganda became widespread, with the goal of selling war bonds, increasing efficiency in factories, combating so-called ugly rumors, and boosting civilian morale. Characters like Rosie the Riveter, Benny the Bungler, and, of course, Captain America were on the front lines of the battle for the hearts and minds of their country. It's likely that Walter Richards' work with General Motors through the Charles E. Cooper studio is what led to their commissioning him for numerous war effort posters during World War II. His Tin Fish, From the Sky piece was included in a 1943 illustration for Pontiac, seen in Life magazine. He later created an illustration to be published in Collier's magazine, to raise awareness that General Motors mass-produced precision parts for various machines. Walter did not choose sides in the war of wartime manufacturers, however. That very same year, 1943, Walter was commissioned by the Packard Motor Car Company of Detroit, Michigan, a major competitor of General Motors, to show their own high-precision parts for the U.S. military.
The thing you got to remember about World War II is, like, every able-bodied man, especially men, they signed up. Like, they didn't need to wait to be drafted or anything. It wasn't like Vietnam. So a lot of them were either involved as artists. Like, a lot of them would sign up, not necessarily to go and like fight on the front line, but they would, wherever they could do the best for the nation with their skills, right? Like, their skills were valued.
Walter created numerous war effort posters and advertisements for companies, including the Eureka Vacuum Cleaner Company, Budweiser, DuPont Cellophane, and more. It's important to point out that in many cases, these advertisements were being commissioned before the product in question had even been released. It was up to these artists to use their artistic edge to create images of jets, planes, boats, and more, with little idea of what the product even looked like.
Well, there was a lot of faith by publishers that any illustrator that they would hire, especially if there was any element of technicality in the artwork that they were commissioning, that artist would do their research. A lot of the people who would read those articles and look at those illustrations, they would have been there. Right, they would have been involved in World War II, and the last thing that the publishers wanted would be like letters to the editor saying, like, your artist, put the wrong type of gun in that soldier's hand or whatever, or that's not the kind of hand grenade that we used in 1942. Or
in one particular case, Walter's unending imagination actually landed him in some hot water. Commissioned to create an advertisement for a then unreleased big bomber plane, Walter added a tail gunner before such a thing had even existed. Fast forward to the bomber's release, and there was a tail gun. Walter was then investigated by the US government under suspicion of being supplied with military secrets. A great deal of Walter's World War II art was turned over to the United States Military Academy Museum in West Point, New York. The museum's curator, Michael E. Moss, described Walter's Save Rubber poster as one of the most popular and well-designed posters of World War II.
There are some illustrators who dream of and speak of the day they can put commercial work behind them and paint. Wally Richards never waited for that day.
Reporters rush out to relay the news to an anxious world.
We are gathered here is a solemn but glorious hour.
It was 4 o'clock Pacific time in San Francisco when the announcement came.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese representatives of the major warring powers. I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day. To conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
Following the end of World War II in 1945, Walter Richards returned to New Canaan. While still with the Charles E. Cooper Studio, work had slowed. Walter was one of many artists in the area who longed for the inspiration and stimulation of working with fellow professionals, harkening back to his participation in the Cleveland Museum of Art's May Show, the very start of his career. With fellow Cooper Studio members Steve Dohanos and Hardy Gramatke, Walter formed the Fairfield County Watercolor Group in 1946.
He was an illustrator, and for the longest time, illustrators weren't considered fine artists. They had this group that met, I think, once a month at different people's house, and they'd all have to bring a piece of artwork. It didn't matter what your medium was. I mean, it could be gouache, it could be multimedia. One guy liked to do all this kitchen cleaning things to make paintings, and then they would critique each other's paintings.
Membership was limited to only 12 artists, which included the likes of Frederick and Eileen Whitaker, Al Kortner, Howard Muntz, fellow Sunbloom alum Harry Anderson, and fellow Charles E. Cooper alum Alex Ross. Said Howard Muntz at the time,
"The main thing is that it forced you to do a painting a month at least. If you were a commercial artist, you were used to deadlines, but this was a deadline above and beyond. The only person you had to answer to was yourself."
Walter Richards left the Charles E. Cooper Studio in 1950 to join the small ad agency Stephen Lyon Inc., where he continued to make illustrations. While Walter's time at the Cooper Studio was over, several clients such as Conoco, Texaco, and Ford carried over. Walter's reputation as a talented World War II illustrator and advertiser preceded him. Around the same time he joined Stephen Lyon Inc., he became the official historian and painter of the United States Air Force. While it's unknown what his first assignment was, it would surely pale in comparison to what is undoubtedly Walter's most significant work with the United States government, perhaps his entire career.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas.
President Kennedy and Governor John Connally have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas.
President Kennedy is reported to be fighting for his life in a Dallas hospital, but reports conflict.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
I thought it was, a firecracker or something like that, and then they followed one shot.
2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy.
Bob Walker, WFAA TV, Dallas, Texas, interrupting. There's been a shooting at Dallas Police Station as Oswald's being transferred. For details, Bill Lord, ABC at City Hall.
On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, at 12:30 p.m., President John F. Kennedy was shot while riding a presidential motorcade through Dallas, Texas. At 1:20 p.m., then Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, surrounded by Secret Service agents, was informed by Parkland Memorial Hospital staff that Kennedy had passed away. Almost 20 minutes later, Johnson left the hospital in an unarmed police car, laying below the car's window level, on his way to Dallas Love Field. At 2:38 p.m., aboard Air Force One, Lyndon Baines Johnson took the oath of office as the 36th President of the United States, with Jackie Kennedy and Lady Bird Johnson by his side, and John F. Kennedy's body on board. 9 minutes later, the presidential airplane departed for Washington, D.C. On December 1st, Walter Richards was tasked by the Society of Illustrators in New York, who were commissioned by the Air Force Historical Foundation, to paint the historic scene of President Johnson being sworn in aboard Air Force One. His recreation of this scene was adapted from several widely published news photographs taken as Johnson was hastily sworn in. His recreation of this scene was adapted from several widely published news photographs taken as Johnston was hastily sworn in. On February 10th, 1964, just over a month later, Walter's painting was shown to the Air Force at a ball in the New York Hilton Hotel. Shortly after, it was presented to President Johnson. Walter's Air Force commissions continued through 1964 and into the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War in 1965.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to talk to you on a subject of deep concern to all Americans and to many people in all parts of the world.
Someone has to give up his life.
How can we win?
So that the United States doesn't have to admit something that the entire world already knows.
Bob Neal died for these medals.
We became involved in the war while my predecessor was in
We
office.
got a Silver Star, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal, 8 Air Medals, National Defense, and the rest of it's garbage. It doesn't mean a thing.
The question at issue is not whether Johnson's war becomes Nixon's war.
Someone has to die so that President Nixon won't be, and these are his words, the first president to lose a war.
In 1966, Walter, along with fellow Fairfield County Watercolor Society founder Hardy Gramatke and military illustrator Al Munchin, traveled to the front lines in Vietnam to photograph and later recreate the horrors of war. While in Vietnam, Walter was given free rein to capture and depict whatever he saw, with little input or restriction by the government. One particularly striking piece by Walter depicted Air Force doctors treating villagers in a nearby town, despite knowing that that same town would be taken over by the Viet Cong that very night. A Bridgeport Sunday Post article, published shortly after Walter's trip to Vietnam, read, "Traveling up the river from Bien Hoa in Vietnam, Walter Richards, of New Canaan, is armed with only Leica and Rolleiflex. His escort wears a bulletproof vest. Mr. Richards feels that the artist on the scene can catch things that the camera might miss." That same month, September of 1966, one of Walter's Vietnam recreations was featured in a September issue of Medical Times, of which his fellow Fairfield County Watercolor Society member, Howard Muntz, was the art director. The piece depicted an Air Force doctor attending to wounded servicemen aboard a military transport plane on its way back to the United States. The work was recreated using notes, drawings, and photographs gathered at the scene. Walter's original painting, from which the Medical Times cover had been adapted, was subsequently presented to, yet again, President Lyndon B. Johnson. Upon viewing the image, Johnson urgently requested Walter's presence at the White House.
Last Wednesday, as I was recovering from Mom's TV experience and taking a nap at 2:30 in the afternoon, the phone rang. It was Howard Muntz, art director for Medical Times. He said, "The president wants to see you." And I said, "The president of what?"
Walter's relationship with the Johnsons continued on past this point. On December 9, 1972, Walter photographed Lyndon B. Johnson, Governor John Connally, Senator Lloyd Benson, and others quail shooting in Texas. Johnson passed away in January of that next year, making Walter's photo and its subsequent painting, Annual Hunt at the Palomas Ranch, some of the last images of the former president. 4 years before the former president's death, Walter completed one more assignment for the Johnson administration. In 1968, he created a block of 4 stamps for their Natural Beauty campaign.
Hey, be nice to that stamp, will you? You see, before
We've preserved several species on stamps. Stamps like this have always made stamp collecting fun.
You hear that, fellas? Dinosaurs are coming to this town.
They're already here.
Dinosaur stamps, they're exciting.
This is me. Start collecting stamps at the post office. Begin with this set of...
This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.
Walter Richards completed 37 stamps in his lifetime, and was close to completing a 38th shortly before his passing. Today, we look at a selection of Walter's most impressive works as a stamp artist. Walter's very first stamp was issued in 1967. Part of a series entitled Prominent Americans, Walter's stamp honored Frederick Douglass, the runaway slave who rose to become a distinguished editor, diplomat, and public servant. In 1968, Walter was commissioned by his newfound friends Lyndon B. and Lady Bird Johnson to create a block of 4 stamps titled The Beautification of America. These 4 stamps encouraged Americans to practice environmental consciousness as a part of the Johnson administration's Natural Beauty campaign. 1 year later, in 1970, Walter collaborated with artist Arnold Copeland on a block of 4 anti-pollution stamps. The left portion of each stamp shows the world as viewed from outer space, with the right portion featuring wheat bent by the wind, children at play with skyscrapers in the background, a fish, or a bird, respectively. All 4 stamps feature text reading, "Save our soil," "cities," "water," or "air," depending on what is depicted. In 1972, Walter returned to solo work, creating a block of 4 stamps depicting the Cape Hatteras National Park on the Atlantic coast of North Carolina. This block was the second in a series of stamps created for the centenary of the United States National Parks. The upper left stamp features a ship's hull rocked by waves. The upper right shows a Cape Hatteras lighthouse, along with surf and surfcasters. Both the bottom left and right stamp depict laughing seagulls on a piece of driftwood. The 4 individual multicolored stamps join together to form one breathtaking image of the coast. Walter's block is the first block in which the design has been perforated into 4 stamps. Walter's largest work as a stamp designer, and quite possibly in his entire career as an artist, was entitled Architecture USA. This 16 stamp block was a tribute to the entire architectural profession, not just the architects and works being presented, and was released from 1979 to 1982. Each stamp featured a notable building along with its designer, their lifespan, and the location of the building itself. This included James Renwick's Smithsonian Institution, Henry Richardson's Trinity Church, Frank Furness's Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, Alexander Davis's Lyndhurst, Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Rotunda, Benjamin Henry Latrobe's Baltimore Cathedral, Charles Bulfinch's Boston State House, William Strickland's Philadelphia Exchange, Sanford White's New York University Library, Richard Morris Hunt's Biltmore House, Bernard Maybeck's Palace of the Arts, Louis Sullivan's National Farmers Bank, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe's Illinois Institute of Technology, Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallingwater, Eero Saarinen's Dulles International Airport, and Walter Gropius's Gropius House. Walter's final stamp was released in 1987. This historical preservation stamp depicts the Timberline Lodge in Mount Hood, Oregon. In addition to being his final stamp, this was Walter's final published work as an artist.
He was absorbed by his work, consumed by art. He wouldn't draw something unless he understood. He taught me a real work ethic, but I also learned to appreciate life and nature.
We set out in this series to show you the life and career of Walter Richards outside of his work here in New Canaan, but by no means should his influence on our town be ignored. And with the number of people Walter's work has touched, it'd really be impossible to do so. Barbara Cleary was one of Fairfield County's top real estate brokers for over 3 decades. In 1986, she opened her own office, appropriately named Barbara Cleary's Realty Guild. In 1998, the Realty Guild was invited to become the exclusive affiliate for Darien, Wilton, and most importantly, New Canaan. Barbara was a longtime fan of Walter's work, specifically his lithographs and linocuts of iconic New Canaan scenes. Upon the Realty Guild becoming the exclusive affiliate for the town of New Canaan, Barbara got the chance to meet the artist whose work she'd admired for so long.
Well, he took me to his back room, and I saw all the different pictures, and he told me of his wood cutting and how he had to do it. And it was a totally unique art. I don't think anyone's ever seen anyone do this. And so it stood out as a unique type of artwork.
Barbara featured 2 of Walter's New Canaan scenes in the centerfold of a booklet showcasing the beauty of our wonderful town. His 1960 depiction of the Strawberry Festival, now known as the Mayfair, and one of his most popular pieces featuring Christmas caroling on God's Acre, Walter's favorite location.
He was very sensitive to the community life, and he truly captured people. New Canaan in my time had a little sense of a Norman Rockwell, and he, town, and when he did his pictures, he had people in the pictures, and people could relate to themselves in the pictures, like the God's Acre singing at Christmas caroling. And that was the most popular of his pictures, it seemed to me. And the Mayfair, you just felt you were there because he had people in those pictures.
In 1999, Walter held his last major exhibition at the New Canaan Graphic Arts Center in Norwalk. Titled Walter Richards, A Career Spanning 7 Decades, it was a quintessential timeline of Walter's work, from his beginnings in the 1920s through to the end of his career in the 1980s. The introduction was written by Walter's good friend and colleague Howard Muntz and included this poignant line.
For those who erroneously regard illustrators as lesser artists, they can be set straight by perusing the lifetime output of Walter Dubois Richards, Wally.
2 years later, Walter yet again made history when the United States Postal Service officially declared July 14th, 2001 to be Glenora and Walter Dubois Richards Day in New Canaan, in recognition of their contributions to the growth and development of the design of postage stamps.
It is harder to draw something when you don't understand what it is.
Walter Richards was more than just a talented illustrator, skilled commercial artist, and civil servant. By 2001, he had 2 children, Tim and Henry, and 6 grandchildren, Andrew, Jennifer, Ken, Camilla, Alex, and Ben. Retired to his garish lane home with Glenora and their many, many cats, Walter Richards enjoyed a quiet life. Or at least as quiet a life as Walter Richards could live.
One time, he took me to the basement of the house. And it was I might as well have been in the Met storage room. I mean, he did a voluminous amount of work. He'd say to me, I don't know what I'm going to do with all these things. And he never did get to, he wasn't able to distribute them.
Lurleen Lapola reminisced about Walter's dedication to spending at least 2 hours a day outside, whether it was laying down pebbles, shoveling dirt, or any recreational activity. The now 93-year-old artist remained active.
But Walter Richards was a strong man. Right to the end, he was a strong personality. This is what I'm here to do. This is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to be up here with the front runners.
But by far, my favorite story came from Walter's grandson, Andrew Richards. You've heard from Andrew throughout this series. He ran a blog on his grandfather from 2011 to 2013, which really served as the foundation for this series.
When he started to lose his sense of balance in his late 90s, he would walk around the house with a bike helmet on, like a motorcycle helmet. And I knew he did that because he was also poking fun at himself, because he wouldn't even strap it. You know, he just kind of throw it on and be like, I'm going to go up the stairs now, and make his way up. And I actually have a picture of him coming down the stairs, and he's just wearing his helmet. And I still have his helmet here with me. I'll just show you.
Oh my!
This is the helmet that he would wear around the house.
Wow.
I don't know if he actually rode a motorcycle or not, but you look at the data in it, and it says 1968. You know, right there. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah.
And I keep this with me in my workspace because, you know, I love that. I love that part of him. I love that part of him.
Walter continued to paint in his spare time until his eyesight began to fail. Not too long after, on May 22nd, 2006, Walter Dubois Richards passed away, just shy of his 99th birthday. Walter is remembered fondly by his family and loved ones. We've heard quite a bit from his grandson, Andrew, but I was fortunate enough to speak with another of Walter's grandchildren, Alex. In his email, Alex reminisced about Walter's stiff whiskers, his gravelly voice, and the tinted glasses which he was rarely seen without. When visiting Walter and Glenora's home, the kids were free to roam wherever they pleased, including both the upstairs and attached studios. Alex confirmed about Walter really what I'd always believed to be true since I started my research. The man never stopped painting. Even after retirement, he was still promoting artwork, taking on new projects. I asked Alex what he thought motivated and inspired Walter as an artist, and he painted a really detailed image for me.
It's like a swimmer treading water, with the current being neither for nor against him. In my father, I sensed a frustration on Walter's account that a strong current wouldn't come their way to help carry them towards their goals.
The world of American art is an elite one, and as we've learned from Leaf Pang, while illustrators of the golden age of advertising were lauded as celebrities, to get there was a lofty task. Walter worked to create and foster connections with the upper echelon of the industry. Even his preferred hobby, tennis, was taken on as a means of opening doors to the larger art world. I won't guess as to whether Walter felt he reached this celebrity status, though I would point out that towards the end of his life he went to great lengths to catalog and preserve his work as an artist. Clearly he felt there was some value there.
You have to work your way through the details in order to get to the big picture.
Walter Richards' work can be found all across the United States. In 1997, his 1935 linoleum cut, Woodcutters, was featured in the Smithsonian Institution's catalog for an exhibition entitled 150 Years of Printmaking, celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Smithsonian. His works are included in collections at the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Lyndon B. Johnson Library and Art Museum, the New Britain Museum of American Art, the Pentagon, the United States Military Academy Museum in West Point, the William A. Farnsworth Library and Art Museum, the Worcester Art Museum, and the Yale University Museum. Additionally, his work has been on display at the American Watercolor Society, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the National Academy of Design, the New York Historical Society, the Pennsylvania Museum of Art, the Philadelphia Print Club, the Royal Society of Painters and Printmakers, the Society of Illustrators, the White House, and the Whitney Museum of Art. Walter's illustrations have appeared in magazines and publications including the American Legion magazine, Argosy, Boy's Life, Collier's, The Coronet, Fortune magazine, Men True Adventure, Reader's Digest, the Saturday Evening Post, Sports Illustrated, Life magazine, Look magazine, Outdoor Life, Men magazine, This Week, and Time magazine. He himself has been featured in Who's Who in American Art, Who's Who in America, and the New York Historical Society's 200 Years of American Illustration. Walter Richards has won countless awards, including the Cleveland Museum of Art's highest prize for lithography, 4 years in a row, the Peggy Egan Award 2 years in a row, the Dr. Morris Woodrow Award, and the Mrs. John Newington Award, all at the Hudson Valley Art Association, the New Canaan Bank and Trust Company Award, the First Professional Award, the New Canaan Graphics Arts Award, and the Carl Chevrolet Award, all at the New Canaan Art Show. He won First Prize in Graphics and First Award in Graphics at the Stanford Art Association. He received First Prize at the New Canaan Outdoor Art Show. He received an honorable mention in the Amateur Color category at the 14th Annual Photographic Exhibition at the Carriage Barn in Waveney Park. He won a Connecticut Society of Architects Award for Environmental Empowerment. And he won Best Stamp Design by the Postal Commemorative Society for American Trees, as well as 2 additional $1,000 prizes, both of which he donated to the New Canaan Library. While with the American Watercolor Society, he received awards from the City of New Mexico Museum exhibit and the Royal Society of Painters and Watercolor in London. He's received awards from the American Watercolor Society, the Connecticut Watercolor Society, and the Brooklyn Museum as a part of their International Watercolor Exhibition. Walter was commissioned to do illustrations by virtually every major institutional account in the world, as well as various other companies including Anheuser-Busch, the Association of American Railroads, Conoco, Coty International, DuPont Cellophane, Eureka, the Ford Motor Company, General Electric, General Motors, Goodyear, Inco Nickel, Magnavox, Robert Burns Cigarillos, Hallmark, the Seagram Distillers Corporation, Texaco, Trans World Airlines, Upjohn, and many, many more.
I recently saw a movie about the father of Impressionism, who dabbled in an immense array of media. And it talked about how he used pastels and how he used gouache and how he used this and how he did that, and he'd sit and look out the window and make the paintings. And I think Wally deserves that kind of recognition. I know it's lofty, I know but he was a very fine artist.
The way I look at his legacy is that his artwork really, because he produced so much over the course of his career, over 70 years. He produced so much, and so much of it is really, it's a glimpse of our life and our society, in a time before we had recording devices.
He really did capture the community spirit, and the community is quite unusual. There's a harmony to the town, and he just could see that, and he seemed to do works that were people participating in the local town events, and just projected a lovely sense of community. He just seemed to capture it in each one of his pictures.
I learned more about teaching from Walter than I did about all those courses they gave you in college.
He played sort of a big role and preserving our heritage, and our lives.
How many people can capture the feeling and the beauty of a community in harmony?
There's a lot of amazing artists that were incredibly prolific in the amount of work that they produce, and were even influential, that just aren't really well known out there. Yeah.
History is, by definition, a collection of past events, a record of important occurrences. We can read about our history in textbooks, online, or simply through sharing stories. But Walter Richards represents a unique means of sharing stories. His work, his lithographs, his illustrations, his posters, his paintings, his stamps, they all capture exact points in history. World War II, the Vietnam War, the swearing in of Lyndon B. Johnson, and the former president's final days on Earth. The beauty of nature before its corruption by industrialization, the construction of the White House, the New Canaan Mayfair. Walter Richards' work speaks volumes of the time period it existed. Be that the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, all the way up to the 2000s. It's so much more than just colors on a page or carvings on a piece of wood. It's life ripped from the real world and put on the page with the artistry, attention, and the love of a man who sought to show just how beautiful it can be. And if all the history books were burned, if the Wi-Fi was down, if we were left with nothing but just the profound work of Wally Richards, I think we'd be in pretty good hands.
There's one story that's coming to mind right now that he would tell that I always found really interesting when he was a kid. And this is something that he felt like defined his personality. He couldn't have been much older than 10, 11, 12 years old. And he said there were a bunch of kids in his neighborhood that picked on him. And they would have like snowball fights with each other. And these kids built up a fortification and would throw things at him. And so he said one day he decided he just lost his temper and he charged them and was able to, he just like went right over the embankment that they built and was able to, I don't know if he beat them up or he scared them off. It was right in front of this home, like right in the front yard of this home of a veteran, a Civil War veteran. This veteran would sit out on his porch in his Union uniform. The Civil War veteran was infuriated, yelling at the kids, saying, how could you let this one kid scare you off like that, you cowards? And he just talked about it with like such pride, like it's like, this is what I did. And of all the things that he accomplished in his life, that's what he would think about.